There are more than 26 million people in the world today who are living as refugees, and half of them are children. Oftentimes, they live in exile without a permanent home for a decade, sometimes 2 decades. What happens to those kids? Do they go to school? How do they learn? Can they ever be expected to lead so-called normal lives? These are questions which preoccupy Sarah Dryden-Peterson. She is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the founder and director of Refugee REACH, which promotes research, education, and action for refugees. And she explains in her book, Right Where We Belong, how refugee teachers and students are changing the future of education, how it's all going to work. Sarah, it's great to welcome you here to TVO.
Thank you.
Nice to
Glad
have you
to
here.
be here.
I want to start by reading an excerpt from your book, Right Where We Belong. Sheldon, if you would, bring this up and I'll read along for those listening on podcast. Millions of refugee children globally risk spending their entire childhoods as if in suspended animation, as if their futures are on hold. They are less likely to go to school, they are less likely to finish school, they are less likely to learn, and they are less likely to feel like they can contribute to their communities. What would it take to ensure that all refugee young people have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging and prepares them to help build more peaceful and equitable futures? I have spent the last 15 years focused on this question. Okay, my first question is about you. Why has this question fascinated and vexed you so much?
That is a good question. You know, I was thinking about this, and I think, like many of us, aspects of our autobiography really shape the kinds of questions that we ask. And I think there were 2 real elements of growing up here in Toronto that really shaped me in wanting and continuing to ask this question. One was that when I was growing up, we had a huge map of the world on the wall of our kitchen. And it was really the focal point of our kitchen and our family life. As we would learn about something that was going on in the world, we would find it on the map. And my parents would talk to my brother and I about various places and ask us questions to try to prompt us to see ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. And the second piece, I think, growing up in Toronto in the 80s and 90s was really about trying to understand migration. That so much of Toronto was being shaped by migration at that time. And I became, as a young person and a teenager, really preoccupied with this question of what it would mean for a new community to be created in a place where people were coming from all over the world, from so many places that we saw on the map in our kitchen, to build a new community in one place that was our home, Toronto.
So it's a very personal story for you in some respects.
It is, yeah.
Cool. There has been an international convention for 7 decades that defines what a refugee is. And let's bring this up as well if we can. This is also from your book. Those who are outside their countries of nationality owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Let's follow up on that. If you are a young refugee living with this kind of fear, sometimes for very long periods of time, are you actually able to be educated?
Right, and this is actually, I think, the real question also at the core of this book, is to try to think about what it means for someone who has been forced to flee their home due to persecution. And I come back to this idea, there's a poet, Washan Shire, who writes that one only leaves home when home won't let you stay. And I really hold that as core in thinking about education of refugee young people. For the most part, people who have not wanted to leave their home and who are trying to build a life in a new place. And often trying to build a life in the context where they still don't have a lot of their rights respected. And sometimes that includes not the right to education, but frequently does not include the right to access opportunities that we think will follow from education. So you and I went to school likely thinking that when we graduated from school, we would be able to find a job and legally be able to work in that job, that we would be able to decide where in the country of our citizenship we wanted to live and build a life and imagine that kind of future. For so many refugee young people, most refugee young people around the world, even if they are living in a country of exile, they don't have that right to long-term residence and to a pathway to citizenship that would allow them to imagine the future there. So this becomes a core question for education, how to educate for a future that really is unknowable in so many ways.
Now, obviously they can be educated, and obviously they, like all young people, they have a desire to be sponges and take it all in. But if you're actually worried about where your next meal is coming from, or whether you got a roof over your head, or whether troops are going to come over that hill and kill your parents, those are not ideal conditions under which to try to learn something new.
Right.
So how does that happen?
Right, and so in many cases, like you're saying, this first element is to really try to think about how can schools become safe places where children feel like they are ready to learn because they feel like they can know what comes next. They feel like they are in a safe place. And I think importantly, this is true not only for students, but also for teachers. So the adults in the building, for example, with students are also fearing the same kinds of security threats to their daily existence. And so that safety becomes key. I think one of the things that we've learned from refugee young people is that thinking about the immediate moment, kind of where the next meal is coming from, that security is essential, but it's not really sufficient to work towards what they're hoping for. And this sense of always thinking about the future, even when the immediate situation feels like an emergency. And I think that's something that has really struck me and as somewhat surprising, I think, in learning from refugee young people. Like, yes, we want to focus on this immediate moment. Yes, we're concerned about it. But don't think for a moment that we're not also concerned about what comes next. And I think this really shapes the way that young people try to navigate their education as they're thinking about not only kind of the next day, but also how do they fulfill the steps that they need in order to graduate from secondary school, for example, or in order to access transnationally, if something is not available locally, the kinds of learning that they're looking for.
One thing that's abundantly clear as you read the book is that you have been all over the bloody world. I mean, you've really been to a lot of places and you've met a lot of people, and we're going to talk about a few of them here, okay? Jacques lives as a refugee in Uganda. Let's start there. Why is he in Uganda?
So Jacques fled to Uganda from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this was some 20 years ago now. As you mentioned earlier, I've been doing this work for a long time and really been able to learn from Jacques over almost all of those years.
Why did he have to leave the DRC?
So he had to leave the DRC because there was ongoing conflict in Eastern DRC. One of the largest civil wars of our time that often goes underreported in our media. And he was a human rights activist. And so he was persecuted, to come back to this definition of a refugee, for the work that he was doing on behalf of his ethnic and linguistic group. So he had to flee to Uganda, where he hoped to find the safety and security that was no longer possible in the home.
And interestingly enough, he doesn't live, or I guess like 60% of refugees, as I learned in your book, he doesn't live in a camp, he lives in a city. Right. Is that a better way for refugees to live?
Yeah, I mean, I think better depends on the situation. And as we see with Jacques, at the time that he lived in Uganda, refugees were not legally allowed to live in the city. But he was a teacher. And when he tried to go to a refugee camp, it wasn't possible for him to build a sustainable life there. And so he decided that, as he'd been taught as a young teacher in Democratic Republic of Congo, that when you arrive in the middle of a forest, of which there are many in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and there are children who are eager to learn, you figure out a way to teach them. And I think this idea of a teacher really having this vocation to teach children wherever they are stuck with Jacques. And so he created a school in Kampala, in the city, for the many refugees who were living there, even though that was counter to policy at that time.
It's in a church.
It was in a church.
It's in a church with a dirt floor.
Yes.
Not what you call ideal circumstances.
No.
But what could he do under those circumstances to educate this group of refugee kids?
I think the part of his circumstances that were ideal, I think, are the elements actually that all of us might remember being the most ideal about our schools, which is the teachers of the students and the relationships among them. So despite the challenging resource environment, Jacques and his fellow teacher really created a situation in which the children wanted to be there, to come back to this idea of the security that students were seeking, even in a place where they didn't have legal right to be, and created the kind of relationships that really allowed those children to feel that sense of wonder at what they were learning. And so that's what he was able to create out of very limited resources.
Where's he today?
He's in Ottawa.
He lives in Ottawa today.
Yeah.
Is he becoming a Canadian citizen?
Yes.
He is.
Yes.
How about that?
Yeah.
Let's talk about Abdi. Born in Ethiopia. When he was a teenager, he watched his parents die. Again, how can you how can you even begin to care about getting an education when you've watched your parents be killed?
Yeah. So I think like in Abdi's situation and in many of the young people we've worked with in Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya, who had fled Ethiopia, fled Somalia, many of them really talk about this idea of contributing to some kind of a future, of ideally, in their words, their home country. And so thinking about not just all of the horrible things that have happened to them, which they're not trying to ignore, but to figure out how to live with, and thinking about how to move forward with that and think about the role that they can play in building a future in their conflict-affected countries. And education is almost always what we hear young people talk about as the key to that. It's not something that has to be rooted in one particular place, but instead something that can really travel with a person and be that capital that they take to build the future for themselves and also for communities.
And where is Abdi now?
Also in Canada.
No kidding, also here.
Yeah.
If you're a refugee, where's the best country in the world to live?
You know, I think this is one of the tricky questions that we face as a global community. I think that what we see is that there's a vastly unequal distribution of where refugees live globally. So more than 73% of refugees live in a neighboring host country. So that means when civil war happens in Syria, that Syrians are fleeing to Lebanon and Turkey. When conflict happens in Democratic Republic of Congo, like for Jacques, refugees are fleeing to Uganda and Kenya. And very few refugees come to Canada, come to the United States. In 2017, 1/4 of the population in Lebanon was a refugee, and at that same time, it was 0.01% of the US population. So we think about this vast difference in where refugees are. You can imagine the kind of resources that can be dedicated to supporting refugees to build a new life when there are very few and when they're arriving over long periods of time than when there might be hundreds of thousands of people. So you can think about kind of a refugee arriving in Canada, coming into a school where there may be very few refugees, and teachers can really focus on the learning needs, addressing any kind of gaps, making sure that parents feel welcome in the school, and that becomes much more challenging in a place where maybe overnight half the class becomes a refugee.
Let me pick up on that, because you mentioned Lebanon, which found itself, I guess, a few years ago, taking in 1.5 million Syrian refugees. How does a country like Lebanon, which is not a rich country, obviously, to begin with, even begin to understand how it will be obliged to educate? I mean, 1.5 million Syrian refugees, do I assume half of them are kids?
Yeah, right.
So how do they find spaces for 750,000 kids like that?
Right. And so this is the immense challenge that countries that are receiving many, many, many refugees are up against. What happened in Lebanon was the development of, over the course of the initial years of Syrians arriving, was the development of a double shift. So this means Lebanese students go to school in the morning, and then in the same buildings, Syrian students come to school in the afternoon. This is actually a pretty common setup for education globally when there are many kids and not the kind of infrastructure. And I think what this enabled was access to schools for Syrian refugees. So there was actually the possibility of Syrian young people coming to school. But the challenge, as this double system kind of points to, is that there's very little opportunity for Lebanese kids and Syrian kids to actually interact with each other, to build the kinds of relationships that, as we talked about with Jacques, were really core to the kind of learning that was going on. And this becomes a challenge over time. Like you said, Lebanon, a country that already has overstretched resources in terms of its education system. I think one of the things that we see in the case of Lebanon too is that over many years, other donors, other international commitments were made to support the education of refugees in Lebanon, and many of those have gone unfunded. And so this leaves Lebanon needing to support the education of refugee children, even though there are global compacts that would suggest all of us have an obligation to contribute to that education.
But I assume those, let's say, 750,000 Syrian refugee kids now in Lebanon, that's 750,000 young people who, if we sort of don't get this right and get them some kind of decent education, they're going to be bad news for the whole world come 15, 20 years down the road. Fair to say?
I mean, yeah, listening to Syrian young people, we were working with grade 9, the equivalent of grade 9 students. And one student said to us, kind of, look at the quality of education we're getting. It's really not what I had hoped for. It's not a high quality education. But she said, there's no country that treats its own citizens, the citizens of other countries, better than its own citizens. So I understand this situation. And I think that's what we stand to lose as a global community if young people start to think that there is this hierarchy of who deserves more. And we think about young people who are living outside of their country of origin, thinking that they deserve less in terms of their education. And that translates into less opportunity then for them to contribute to future lives in Syria, future lives in Lebanon, or wherever their journeys might take them.
Right. This line that you say to your students at Harvard really grabbed me. It's, how will this program, the one you are teaching, how will this program affect the lives of real people? You're obviously trying to get your students not to just see this as some academic exercise, but this is serious, on the ground. You got to change people's lives somewhere in the world. What answers do you come up with when you ask that question?
So this is a project that students engage in where they interview one person to try to understand their trajectory through education and conflict. And often there's pushback in saying, well, this is just one person. How can I learn about what policies I should implement or what programs I should design? But what I think it does is force us all to ask that question in moments where we're sitting with a policy that says, for example, the language of instruction in a host country for a refugee will be the language of that host country. To think not only about what is practical, obviously that's much more practical than trying to educate in 20 different languages, but also what that might mean for the trajectory of a young person. To think about another person I write about in the book, Henri, who was educated in multiple languages in his time in Tanzania, where the language of instruction changed, and then he returned to Burundi, although he'd actually never lived in Burundi. He was born in Tanzania, and wasn't fluent enough in the languages that were required by the university to be able to continue going to school. And so to have these trajectories of individual people in our heads when we're thinking about policies, I think really changes the nature of what we end up deciding not only is cost efficient at the time or pragmatic, but also stands a chance of actually creating more opportunities for refugee young people.
You tell me if I'm going out on a limb here, but I would think that we ought to be good at this, given that the first refugees that we dealt with was 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, when the United Empire Loyalists left the United States, came up to Canada. We've been at this for a while. Are we any good at this?
I think that every generation has to learn to be good at creating community with other people in many ways. I think one idea that I keep coming back to, this is an anthropologist, Mary Catherine Bateson, talks about how most educators, this is in the US, live within 100 miles of where they were born. But they might as well be immigrants themselves because the world has changed on them. And I think we forget this, that even those of us who may stay where it is that we're born, the world changes around us, and we need to learn how to navigate these new situations. Some of the new work that we're doing is really trying to think not only about refugees, but also about longtime residents, and how does solidarity among refugees and longtime residents both develop initially, but also how do we sustain it over time? And this is what I think we've been less good at in many ways, is thinking about how do we consider both the needs of those who have never moved as well as those who have moved, and bring people together to create new types of learning in schools, for example.
Well, let's conclude then around the original question that we asked at the beginning of our conversation, which was, what would it take to ensure that all refugee young people have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging?
Yeah.
Okay, what would it take?
I think one of the things I do in the book is try to really think about these concentric circles of our spheres of action. And I think that one of the biggest questions and challenges is to think about the root causes that are driving people to need to flee their homes in the first place. So what is it about home that won't let people stay? And how do we think about the kinds of politics and economics that would support more people to stay in the places they love that are home? Related to that, I think, are migration policies that really end up keeping people out. And the way this relates to education is that, so for a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, for example, doesn't know how long they will be able to stay in Lebanon, because that residence is contingent on the the government there saying, okay, we'll extend this ability for Syrians to stay here for a given amount of time.
Which someday they might not.
Which someday they might not. And as a student, you're thinking about, well, someday they might not. Will I be able to finish primary school? Will I be able to finish secondary school? What will happen if that someday comes and this refuge has expired? And so as we think about migration policies that, for the most part, are intended to keep people out, how do we think about the ways in which those policies really influence young people as they're going through school? I think the third element is really about how we as a global community think about the places where most refugees are being educated. And so those of us sitting in Toronto, what responsibility do we have to the Syrians who are being educated in Lebanon, or to the Rohingya who are being educated in Bangladesh, or to the Venezuelans who are being educated in Colombia? That is not, should not be the sole responsibility of those countries that have opened their borders in order for people to live there. And then I think the fourth level is really within the classroom. And this is what we see, I think, most in this book, is that teachers and young people are trying to create this sense of belonging by really opening up, for example, the kinds of histories that they teach so kids can see themselves represented in that history, trying to open up this opportunity to talk about not only the way things are today that can feel very discriminatory, but also the way young people hope they will be in the future, and those very micro level interactions that are hard to build policy around, hard to legislate, are really the core of what it would take to develop this kind of education.
Great. I have one last question, and I won't pretend it's the most important question I'm going to ask you today. Who is your favorite goaltender in the history of the National Hockey League?
My dad.
Sheldon, there we go. You recognize that guy?
Of course.
You're Ken Dryden's daughter. Wanted to get that on the record there. Because he's been in that chair a few times.
I know he has. Yeah, it's been fun to watch him.
We enjoy his visits here as well.
Great.
He's almost as good as you as a guest. That's Sarah Dryden-Peterson, Right Where We Belong, How Refugee Teachers and Students Are Changing the Future of Education. Sarah, it's great to meet you, and thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks so much, Steve. Great to see you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.